Frank mentioned the trial that I had the privilege of prosecuting before Judge Mukasey now 20 years ago, and I was joking with Brian Kennedy as we both came up in the elevator this morning over the fact that we're still talking about exactly the same thing 20 years later. I at that point I think said that we hadn't made any progress, but what I'd really like to talk about today is 20 years of regression, because I think that's really what the history as unfolded demonstrates. There's three dimensions to the challenge that we're dealing with. There is a legal aspect to it, a military aspect, and a cultural aspect. And I think we have regressed on every front because we never took up the cultural challenge in the first place. We originally regarded radical Islam in the United States as a legal matter. That's how I got involved in it. That's how we dealt with it at the beginning. We eventually, I think too late in time, but eventually realized that we were dealing with more of a national security challenge in terms of the violent jihadist aspect of it. But we really never took on the ideology that fuels the threat against us, and as a result, I think we've gone backwards on each dimension. I've probably said over the years about every bad thing you can say about using the civilian justice system as the point of the spear in terms of the government's counterterrorism policy. Let me begin by just saying the one really good thing about it. And that is that no matter what the government was saying, whether it was on in the White House, the Rose Garden, the steps of the Justice Department, press releases, etc., what went on in the four corners of our trial was reality. Because we have the good fortune of a system in which the decision is left to 12 ordinary Americans, and ordinary Americans, sensible, common sense, right-thinking Americans, are not going to convict people, particularly of very serious offenses, absent being shown not only what was done, but why it was done. So no matter what Washington was saying and no matter what the government was saying elsewhere, in the four corners of our trial, we got to prove that what we were dealing with was militant Muslims whose ideology is taken directly from Scripture, who are animated by revered figures in Islam, and who carried out threats, carried out terrorist strikes for that reason. We also learned that their ideology was a lot more mainstream than we would like to think. I mean, if you listen to what the government was saying in Washington, you would think that there were 12 knuckleheads in Jersey City, and if we got rid of them, everything would be peachy. But in point of fact, what we found when we put witnesses on the stand, including people who were authentically moderate Muslim people who testified in our defense case, every now and then a question about Islamic ideology and theology would come up. What is Jihad? What is Sharia? And the like. And we had witnesses who said, and these were no more terrorists than anyone sitting around this table, I wouldn't be competent to answer that. You'd have to ask him. And they would point to the homicidal maniac who was sitting in the corner of our courtroom. And with respect to that man, I want to point something out, because I think a lot of the conversation we have about Sharia gets very abstract for people. I'd like to bring it down to a more concrete level. Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh Frank mentioned, had, besides being blind from about the age of 4, almost every malady that you can imagine. And as a result, he was utterly useless to a terrorist organization. Couldn't build a bomb, couldn't conduct an assassination, couldn't hijack a plane. The only thing he could do was run it. And why was he able to run it? Because contrary to what our government on a PR side was putting out about the terrorists that we were dealing with, about how they were wanton killers, about how they essentially were barbaric for no discernible reason, Omar Abdul Rahman was a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence, graduated from Al-Azhar University, which we've heard about earlier today, the seat of Sunni learning, as Judge Mukasey said, since the 10th century. His ability to control terrorism, his ability to command terrorism, was solely and only a function of his mastery of Sharia. That was the only reason he was able not only to be in a terrorism organization, but actually to run it, and actually to command acts of mass murder. That's what we're dealing with. And there shouldn't be any doubt when you look at that in a common sense way that that is the ideology that animates this, and that we couldn't conceivably defend the country without understanding it. We limped along for about 8 years on the idea that you could indict the Jihad into submission, and the country got attacked again and again. The threat got bigger and bigger, as you would expect when they were using bombs and we were using subpoenas. That didn't work out well. And ultimately, there was a moment of clarification in 9/11, when for a moment in time, we recognized that this was a national security threat, not something that we could handle as a criminal justice problem, and it had to be attacked from a law of war framework rather than by civilian due process. And in conjunction with that moment of clarity, President Bush gave a speech about a week after the 9/11 attacks that still remains the roadmap for victory. Would that anyone were actually interested in victory, and would that we had actually followed it. But what he said then, now 14 years later, is just as true today as it was then, which is that we have to attack violent jihadists anywhere on earth without geographical limitation that they operate, and we have to treat state sponsors of terrorism as the enemy, as if they were the terrorists that they were aiding and abetting. Unfortunately, I think over the years, that which was known as the Bush Doctrine got enmeshed with democracy promotion, which I don't think was a critical aspect of it from the beginning. But in terms of dealing with the violent aspect of the challenge, that remains the case. We have to have the military will and capability to hit the terrorists wherever they operate, and we have to treat the regimes that aid and abet them as if they were the terrorists themselves. And if we did that, and if we had, which we should have built by now, a legal construct that was directed at this unique threat, which is doesn't present as a traditional war, but is certainly much more like a war than a crime wave, and where we're able to detain people under the laws of war indefinitely, and do it in a way that we can get national political support for it, we would have the military part of this right, and we'd have the legal part of it right. But we will continue to lose, as we're losing now, if we don't address the cultural aspect of it. The Muslim Brotherhood has been building an infrastructure in the United States for more than half a century. We are way behind in dealing with this. They started with the Muslim Students Associations back in the 50s and 60s. There are now about 600 chapters of that organization across the United States and Canada. If you want to get a sense of the problem, Mohamed Morsi, the president of Egypt, who basically turned that country into ruin in about 18 months, grew up in the cauldron of Islamic supremacism in Egypt. He was radicalized in the United States. He was a member of the Muslim Students Association in California. And it's from that organization that everything builds out. The Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, CARE, which is the PR aspect of it, IIIT, which Steve talked about before, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is kind of the think tank, the North American Islamic Trust, which buys up the property. They are implementing a strategy that is no secret. It's very knowable. It's something that that the Muslim Brotherhood's been preaching since the 1920s. But if we don't grapple with it, and we don't challenge it, and we don't roll it back, it really almost doesn't matter what we do on the law enforcement and the military side.